Hello everybody, I'm so glad to be with you. You are another Romanian audience after my 3 presentations last September to help inaugurate the National Lifestyle Medicine Congress sponsored by the Romanian Society of Lifestyle Medicine under the leadership of Dr. Emanuela Mercore Hutanu. And I'm delighted to be invited by your Dan Voiculescu Foundation to contribute to your special events this month with a focus on regenerative medicine, the prevention and reversal of chronic disease, and their impact on longevity. Now, among many thoughtful questions raised about a diet and non-communicable disease relationship, 3 major questions have emerged. Number 1, are fork and knife complicit in the cause and cure of chronic diseases? Number 2, is there a diet and chronic disease relationship? And number 3, what is that relationship? Well, we're beginning to understand more and more that most chronic diseases cannot be cured with pills and procedures. This is one of the main reasons why we have seen the emergence and explosive growth of the lifestyle medicine movement, the fastest growing medical specialty in North America and now found in 42 countries in the world. Why the emergence and energetic expansion of lifestyle medicine? Because today's epidemic of modern killer diseases, such as heart disease and stroke and hypertension, arthritis and overweight and diabetes, cannot be lessened, assuaged, and mitigated through pills and procedures. The best modern medicine can do is improve the quality of life by managing the symptoms, but cures for these chronic diseases are rare and elusive. Well, take coronary heart disease. You get your medications, you get your procedures such as bypass surgery and stents, and yet the underlying disease process continues. Regardless of all those medical treatments, you're going to die with heart disease because we have not found a medical cure for its underlying pathology. Or take diabetes. You had pre-diabetes for 5 years, but you didn't know about it. It developed into full-fledged type 2 diabetes, and eventually you got the diagnosis of the ill, and it was matched with a pill. But before too long, the dose had to be increased. More medications had to be added, ending with insulin injections. Did these medications stop the disease, the diabetes? Did these medications protect you from the cardiovascular complications of diabetes, like blindness, amputations of toes and legs, renal deterioration, stroke and heart disease, and impotence in men? Despite the enlargement and sophistication of our pharmaceutical armamentarium, diabetes today continues unabatedly because we have no medical cure for diabetes. The best modern medicine can do for a diabetic is to settle for trying to control the blood sugar levels. On the other hand, the scientific evidence today points out that the modern killer diseases, these chronic diseases, can be successfully treated, reversed, and cured. How would you do that? How would you cure heart disease or hypertension? How would you cure arthritis and diabetes type 2? Well, check the board-certified medical specialty of lifestyle medicine. These lifestyle medicine specialists will tell you you have a great chance to do it with an enlightened, health-promoting lifestyle. You do it with intelligent self-care. This prominently involves a simple, more traditional diet of foods as grown. It also involves a consistent, progressive exercise program and sufficient rest and sleep, abstinence from alcohol and tobacco smoke, and becoming a kinder and nicer person. These are the pillars of lifestyle medicine. Health-promoting habits that will activate the body's innate ability to begin to heal itself. So, let's briefly review the role of fork and knife as weapons of mass destruction in the etiology of common chronic diseases. Did you know that most of our modern killer diseases were difficult to find some 100 years ago in the United States? Look at Dr. William Osler's book, published in 1928. He reported that heart disease was so rare that one was lucky finding one heart attack a year in a hospital in an average-sized town. But look at the change now. Today, we register more than 3,000 heart attacks a day, with cardiovascular disease in America now being responsible for 30% of all deaths, while the percentage of cardiovascular deaths in Romania is twice as high, namely 60% of all deaths. Or look at the change in the width of our chairs in America. From 1900 to 1970, over a period of 70 years, the width of the average chair hardly changed, just from 43 to 45 centimeters. But then, suddenly, we now are at 61 centimeters. America has emerged larger than ever, so that now 74% of the adult population is either overweight or obese. And with obesity, you must be concerned about diabetes, which has increased by 300% within 30 years, doubling every 10 years. And with obesity, you also must be concerned about high blood pressures, heart disease, arthritis, asthma, sleep apnea, and certain adult cancers, which are all promoted and fueled by excessive weight. Take a look at the increase in the incidence of breast cancer in America. In 1960, in a lifetime, 1 in 20 women developed breast cancer. That has now increased to 1 in 7. That's a 300% increase within 40 years. The question then is, with all the advances in medical technology, such as advances in diagnostics and in emergency care, and advances in dealing with episodic diseases such as most infectious diseases, why do we have such an unprecedented increase in these chronic diseases, especially during the last 50 years? Could it be related to the dramatic changes in our food supply? Look at the change in the macronutrients, in the energy carriers of our food. The diet composition of a society changed along with the increase in the national gross domestic product, the income of a society. You see, potatoes turn into potato chips. Corn turned into corn chips. Beans turned into burgers. And oats became Oreos. Whole grains became refined flour for pizzas, donuts, cookies, and cakes. And milk was replaced with soda drinks. And to enhance their flavor and their level of addictiveness, common and traditional foods became adulterated with excessive amounts of salt, sugar, and fat, all affecting the pleasure centers of the brain. The outcome was a standard American diet that you see on the right-hand side of the graph, mostly consisting of fats and sugar, and at the same time, over time, you see a significant increase in protein, mostly from animal sources, and a decline in whole food starch, which dwindled precipitously and was largely replaced with the refined flour starch. And to unpack this major change in the diet composition, we need to look at two major dietary shifts. Beginning with the 1970s, whole foods became industrialized products, stripping them of their nutrients and fiber while increasing their caloric density. We shifted from slow foods to fast foods, and from eating at home to eating out. A new industry came into full bloom devoted to the refining, processing, and engineering of new foods. It created new flavors and titillating tastes. Backed by creative marketing efforts, all this dramatically increased the number of empty calories. Empty meaning devoid of nutritional value. These empty calories, largely coming from sugar and refined oils and fat, now account for at least 44% of all the calories eaten in America. Empty calories. As a society, we become overfed and undernourished. But don't overlook a second dietary shift, and that was the increase in meat consumption, especially in processed meats, from a total of 56 to 91 kilos per person per year over a period of 100 years. But also look at the increase in the consumption of cheese, an addictive, engineered food very high in fat and salt, with saturated fat prominently related to blood cholesterol levels and thus to heart disease. Cheese now makes its contribution to the development of atherosclerosis and circulatory disease by now having emerged as a #1 source of saturated fat in the standard American diet. No wonder we're in trouble. So this then is the American diet that everybody wants and clamors for. It's a diet where 55% of the calories come from refined processed foods, 31% comes from dairy and animal products, and this is the point that I want to make. And only 14% of the calories that we eat in America today, only 14% of the calories eaten come from fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes like beans and lentils, and some nuts. These are the very foods that come out of the hand of a master designer. These are traditional foods as they come to us in nature. Let me just emphasize my point once more. Only 14% of the calories we consume in America today come from foods as grown, from traditional foods as they come to us in nature. And the question is, what is the impact of these dietary changes taking place around the world? Well, here's Dr. Walter Willett from Harvard University. He said, epidemiologists, people who study the epidemic of these diseases, have long known that the major determinants of our killer diseases are dietary and lifestyle factors. In large convincing population studies, epidemiologists have demonstrated that when countries shift from their traditional diet to this rich Western diet, that they will see the emergence of Western diseases within 5 to 10 years. Case in point, in Japan, heart disease after World War II was so rare that the University of Tokyo Medical School had to actually import diseased coronary arteries from Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore to show Japanese medical students what was then killing every second American, coronary heart disease. In due time, however, the University of Tokyo no longer had to import these diseased coronary arteries from America because the Japanese had become self-sufficient. They had developed their own heart disease. This then gave rise to the concept that Western diets precede Western diseases. Now, let's focus on the heart and the coronary arteries sitting on top of the heart muscle, and then look at the inside of these coronary arteries. Here you see the coronary arteries in cross-section. At birth, there are no encumbrances on the inside of the artery. No atherosclerotic plaque buildup consisting of cholesterol, fats, and calcium that could possibly narrow the arterial lumen of the coronaries. But after 45 years on the standard American diet, we can expect some 50 to 60% narrowing of these coronary arteries. Yeah. But even so, these blood flow restricting processes are asymptomatic until there is at least some 70% narrowing. That's why, all too often, for some 40% of the people, the first sign of heart disease is sudden death. However, the underlying pathology called atherosclerosis is not only affecting the coronary arteries. Atherosclerosis is a systemic issue affecting all major arteries from the top of the head all the way down to the feet. There are many diseases in many different locations with many different names, treated with many different specialties, and yet there's only one major underlying pathology, and that is atherosclerosis, which then expresses itself as myocardial infarction or angina pectoris when affecting the coronary arteries, or as stroke, senility, memory loss, hearing loss, visual loss when affecting the arteries of the brain. All of these are circulation-related illnesses. They are vascular diseases, including hypertension, prominently associated with the renal arteries, as well as gangrene, intermittent claudication, and degenerative disc disease. But then, men also must be concerned about erectile dysfunction or impotence. Considering the relatively small diameter of the penile arteries, they can easily get narrowed down with atherosclerotic plaques, obviously compromising a sustained optimal blood flow. Over 50% of American men today have some degree of erectile difficulty, which is one of the earliest presentations of vascular disease. Erectile dysfunction then becomes a harbinger, a forerunner, an early announcer of a generalized atherosclerotic presence in the body. Are there any antecedents or predictors for these circulatory diseases? What drives this underlying disease process called atherosclerosis and its inflammatory aspects? Are there any risk factors? Well, take a closer look at this risk arch. The higher the risk factor is located on this risk arch, the more powerful it is in driving this disease. And so, the number one risk factor is cholesterol, and then high blood pressure and smoking. And then you look at diabetes, obesity, and high triglycerides. And of course, inactivity, stress, and perhaps some genetics, although epigenetics can overrule this, as we're learning nowadays. These risk factors, these determinants of atherosclerosis and vascular diseases are related to the 3 F's. The first F is the fork, the diet, as designated here by these yellow stars. Please note, this first F is related to 5 of the 8 risk factors. Foods. The second F is the fingers, that's smoking. And the third F is the feet, exercise. 3 F's. They are largely under our control. What about genes? Oh, genes don't determine our future. The new science of epigenetics has taught us that we can turn on or off those genes that code for disease or health. Well, if it's not genes, then what determines our future? Well, you'd be surprised, right? Our habits. The question then is, what do our habits foster, nurture, and support? That's the question. The late Dr. William Conner, a pioneer in the atherogenesis in animals, said, if you want to produce atherosclerosis, if you want to produce a heart attack in monkeys, for instance, all you have to do is feed them a lot of cholesterol and saturated fat. And then he said, if ever a human disease can be produced in animals, it's atherosclerosis. All it takes is a lot of cholesterol and a lot of saturated fat. Many prominent long-term health studies carried out at Harvard University suggest that 70% of our stroke is preventable, 71% of cancer, 82% of heart disease, and 91% of type 2 diabetes, all preventable, totally preventable, if we could just make some lifestyle changes. And experts today have estimated that some 80% of chronic disease in America could be prevented by making significant changes in diet and exercise. Well, what about Dr. Dennis Burkitt, a giant of a man, father of the dietary fiber concept and the discoverer of the Burkitt lymphoma, a cancer once prominent in African children. When honored in front of 600 physicians who came to applaud him for receiving the equivalent of the American Nobel Prize in Philadelphia in 1992, they heard him say, "The greatest medical discovery in the last 20 years, from 1970 to 1990, was the understanding that our modern killer diseases are largely lifestyle related, and therefore they must be preventable and potentially reversible." So now we discussed fork and knife as weapons of mass destruction. But what would happen if we would use fork and knife differently? Could we possibly discover them as instruments of hope, health, and healing in arresting and reversing our lifestyle-related chronic diseases? So let's take a look at what happened to President Clinton. 2004, at the age of 58, he underwent quadruple coronary bypass surgery because of chest pains. 6 years later, in 2010, with recurring chest pains, he underwent a double stenting to keep the restenosing arteries open.
I was lucky I didn't die of a heart attack.
Former President Clinton, like too many people, was busy. And for years he ignored warning signs from his heart. But in 2004, during an exhausting book tour, there was something different.
I had a real tightness in my chest when I was getting off the airplane, and it was the only time I'd had it unrelated to exercise.
We're here outside New York Presbyterian Hospital. In just a couple of hours, President Bill Clinton, former president, is scheduled to undergo surgery.
So I immediately went down to our local hospital, and they did a test. They said, "You got real problems." They hustled me down to Columbia Presbyterian, and they confirmed the determination that I had serious blockage and needed the surgery.
The doctors immediately knew options were limited. The 58-year-old Clinton needed to have his chest opened, his heart stopped, and surgery performed.
There's no medical treatment for reversing the obstructions that have already formed in his blood vessels.
I got Hillary and Chelsea there, and all I remember is it was happening fast, and everybody who cared about me was scared, and I felt rather serene. I thought, gosh, we dodged a bullet. I didn't have a heart attack.
On Labor Day in 2004, Mr. Clinton had 4 blood vessels bypassed.
Starting this morning around 8 o'clock, he had a relatively routine quadruple bypass operation. We left the operating room around noon, and he is recovering normally at this point. So I think right now everything looks straightforward.
Huh. Another life saved, right? Really? Do we have a cure for heart disease? Will bypass surgery be the answer? The cure for President Clinton? Well, 6 years later, he is readmitted to the hospital with recurring chest pain. And with a reputation of being a big lover of fast foods and now being in the hospital again, his cardiologist at New York Presbyterian Hospital wanted to protect him from being seen as a victim of his dietary lifestyle. And so this physician made the statement that, well, this hospitalization was not the result of his lifestyle or his diet. No, really? What we have to remember, he said, is that heart disease is a chronic condition. We don't have a medical cure for this condition, but we have excellent treatments. Well, let's take a look at these treatments. Medical technology provides indeed many successful outcomes for acute and episodic diseases that come and go. We are unexcelled in diagnostics and in emergency care, and for chronic diseases, we have many treatments, but cures are rare and elusive. So let's take a look at bypass surgery. This year in America, we will do some 400,000 bypasses, and the average cost is 140,000 euros per surgery. And yet, within 12 to 18 months, about 40% of these grafted vessels are no longer functioning. We're talking about a 38 to 46% graft failure. The graft has become affected by atherosclerotic plaques because apparently very few, if anyone, is really telling these patients, you have been given a second chance. You must take advantage of that. If you want to keep these grafted vessels open and prevent the other arteries from clogging up, then you must stop smoking. You must get into a daily exercise program, and you must become committed to follow a diet that's whole food, plant-based. Limit your cholesterol and your fat intake. The best and most even-handed estimates are that only about 10% of heart attack patients have their life extended after bypass surgery. Newsweek magazine ran a special feature on that some time ago. I saw these surgical knives pointing to the chest of this patient, and I wondered, why are they bad-mouthing bypass surgery? What's going on? And then, next to the picture was the writing, one word that could save your life. And I thought, what could that one word be? And then reading the article, I discovered that this one word consisted of 2 letters. What do you think that word was? A 2-letter word that would save your life? And the letters were N-O. No. The article talked about the limitations of bypass surgery. It made the argument that probably 80% of these bypass surgeries could be avoided, could be replaced, could be taken care of in a different way through a lifestyle medicine approach. They referred to the research studies of doctors Ornish and Esselstyn, who had reversed and scientifically documented that these atherosclerotic plaques in the arteries did indeed begin to melt down, they regressed, and they opened up again within less than 1 year. Now, aside from bypass surgery, we also have angioplasty and stents. And again, here in the United States, we do about 1 million of these stents a year at an average cost of about 30,000 euros. And that is if everything goes well. But do they last? Someone disrespectfully said to me the other day, well, stents are like Pringles, like potato chips. Stents are like potato chips? Well, he said, you'll never just take one. And then he repeated it. Stents are just like Pringles. You never just take one. Yeah, that reminds me of one of my patients who had 13 consecutive stents. These stents don't last unless the needed lifestyle changes are made. And so, after the double stenting, the chief of cardiology commented on the Clinton case and said, well, actually, essentially, a stent is just a tune-up. We see people like this who come to us every 4 to 5 years. Well, actually, that's a very optimistic time frame because much of the data suggests that these stents don't really stay functional that long unless the needed lifestyle changes are made. So what about statin drugs? The most profitable drugs in the history of medicine, with over 1 trillion euros sold last year alone. What's the data? Take a look. Statin drugs, when used after a heart attack to reduce cholesterol after a heart attack, lowered the all-cause mortality by 14%. And the need for revascularization, it was reduced by 38%. So statin drugs are obviously useful in secondary prevention. On the other hand, most of these statin drugs today are not prescribed for secondary prevention, they're prescribed for primary prevention. They're prescribed in the belief that by lowering the cholesterol, they can prevent a heart attack. But what is the data really telling us? A major meta-analysis of 11 randomized controlled trials with over 65,000 participants showed that the statin drugs indeed dropped the LDL cholesterol by 30% from 3.6 to 2.5 millimoles per liter. And you say, well, that's great. With cholesterol playing such an eminent role in the development of heart disease and atherosclerosis, obviously these drugs have their place and purpose. Yeah, but then comes the second line. Quotes, but no evidence was found for any benefits of statin drugs on all-cause mortality. These drugs did not protect the heart. They did not affect the longevity of a person in this high-risk primary prevention setting, where they followed these patients for 4 years. And here's the editorial in the Journal of the American Medical Association by the editor. She wrote, "We have underestimated the risk of statin drugs, approaching 20% of patients at risk for muscle aches and pains and at risk for developing possibly diabetes and memory loss." And then she continued, if we give 100 men who never had a heart attack before, if we give these 100 men these statin drugs for 5 years, we might expect to prevent, how many? 1 to 2 heart attacks. Just imagine, you take 100 men at risk for a heart attack, and you give these men statin drugs to lower their cholesterol by 30%, and you give them these drugs for 5 years at a cost of some 500,000 euros. And what you might get is a likely benefit of preventing 1 or at the most 2 heart attacks in 5 years. And then she asked the rhetorical question, well, what shall we do? And she answered, a healthy lifestyle, a simple diet, and daily exercise. Well, we could also talk about medications that are used for lowering diabetic blood sugar levels or for lowering high blood pressure. And again, these medications don't cure. At best, they manage, they control the levels. And there are always side effects. Here's one. The ACCORD study dealing with diabetics. They provided maximum optimal medication doses to observe the effect of possibly slowing down the disease progression of diabetes. And what did they find? It was shocking. This large multi-centered study had to be prematurely discontinued, terminated, because of an increased number of deaths from heart disease. What are the lessons to be learned in this case? The more drugs, the higher the dose, the better the outcome? No. The more dangerous, the more harm you might actually encounter. And this can also be true for many high blood pressure medications. Some of them are very costly. Most of these drugs are not preventing a heart attack, although they may be helpful in preventing and delaying a stroke. But there are always side effects that the patient should be aware of. And as you know, when it comes to high blood pressure medications, one of them could very well be a decreased libido or impotence. So here's a classic patient-doctor scenario. He said, the doctor told me I would probably be taking these blood pressure pills for the rest of my life. Yeah. And probably not just one drug, but 2 and 3 or 4 blood pressure medications and another 2 or 3 to treat their side effects. And so the idea that for every ill there's a pill, that's a dream that certainly has not been fulfilled when it comes to chronic diseases. Now, this approach has been successfully used with many infectious diseases. For every ill, a pill. We can stop a urinary tract infection in 10 days with antibiotics. We can do the same thing with bronchitis. 10 days and the bacterial infection is gone. And so, when it comes to chronic diseases, people have similar expectations. But most chronic diseases are not caused by some bacterial pathogen. that an antibiotic can knock out within a couple of weeks. No, our modern killer diseases are largely diet and lifestyle related. That's the message I want to get across to you. In the New England Journal of Medicine, the authors wrote, cultural expectations of immediate, simplistic solutions have been bolstered by consumerism and advertisements and fully exploited to generate demand for therapies that are, well, often marginally indicated and potentially unsafe. Have we perhaps oversold the idea that for every ill, there's a pill, especially when it comes to chronic diseases? Look at the data from the government's Centers for Disease Control. It shows that prescription drugs were responsible for 246,000 fatal adverse drug reactions. This makes prescription drugs the number 3 cause of death in America, responsible for 11% of all American deaths. I'm sure you have seen this chart before. Number 1 cause of death in America, heart disease and stroke. Number 2, cancer. And number 3 cause of death, prescription drugs. Now, either these drugs were not taken properly or the complications with other drugs were not anticipated or they were just not properly prescribed. Number 3 cause of death in America, prescription drugs. Well, take a look at this picture. What do you see there? Well, you see people in green uniforms. They all have mops in their hands. You see water on the floor, lots of it. And they're all trying to keep the floor dry. They're so devoted to their task that they may even forget to make time for their families. They're devoted to only one thing, to keep the floor dry. They even pass out umbrellas to patients that are there to keep them dry. But take a closer look. What's the problem? What's the real problem? What's wrong with this picture? Well, would it not be smart to look for the cause of the flooding, namely the leaking pipes? What we need then is not more mops. What we need is not more doctors and nurses who take care of the symptoms, the water on the floor. What we need is a plumber who takes care of the cause of the flooding. America now spends 86% of the nation's medical budget on managing the symptoms of chronic disease. 86%. We're not curing these diseases, we're merely managing their symptoms to improve the quality of life, but cures are rare and elusive. Instead of pouring most of our efforts into symptomatic relief, should we not take the offensive in tackling the causes of these modern killer diseases, our cultural lifestyle patterns, our habits, and our health eroding practices? These are the causes that cannot be cured by some mechanical device or by some magic pill. Look at this chart more closely. And you see in 1960, we spent 5% of our income as a society on medical care. As you move to the very far right, however, you see that in 2020, we spent some 20% of our income on medical care. And yet during those last 60 years, our chronic diseases have not become less. Instead, they have markedly increased because our culture and our personal choices are promoting a lifestyle that is aversive to health. It undermines health. But can you really reverse these diseases with a better lifestyle? Well, let me go through some studies. The first major indication occurred during World War II. In 1940, Nazi armies invaded Norway, occupied the country, took all the lifestyle to feed their soldiers, and the Norwegian people had to live and settle on simple food of mostly homegrown foods. What was the result? Well, with all the fears, the worries and anxieties, with all the stress of the war, one would have expected an increase in heart disease, right? Wouldn't you? Not so. Restricted in their diet to simple, mostly homegrown foods, the coronary death rates rapidly dropped, suggesting that a very simple diet may have mitigated the results of the stress-filled war years. But then look what happened after the war when it was over in 1945. Well, people returned to their pre-war diet, and the diseases came roaringly back. Another indication for disease reversal came from animal experiments. We knew that we could actually create heart disease in monkeys by feeding them a diet high in cholesterol and saturated fat. But could we reverse these diseases in these monkeys? All we have to do is feed them a simple, low-fat, natural, whole food diet. What did Dr. William Castelli from the Framingham Heart Study actually advocate? To reverse heart disease, use foods as grown. Use plant-based foods. Use whole foods. Well, yeah, okay, maybe that might work for monkeys, but what about humans? Any studies there? Any data? Yes, there is. In 1960, a young cardiologist, Dr. Dean Ornish, published a report in the Lancet Medical Journal that shook up the medical community. What happened? Dr. Ornish spent 1 year studying 48 men with advanced heart disease. Many of them were candidates for coronary bypass surgery. He randomly assigned the men to two groups. Both groups were asked to quit smoking and to walk daily. In addition, the first group also practiced stress management and followed a strict plant-based whole food diet with only 7% of the calories coming from fat and with virtually no cholesterol. The second group was given the standard American Heart Association prudent diet for heart disease. This diet allowed for 30% of calories as fat and up to 300 milligrams of cholesterol a day. At the end of the year, when the results were presented at the scientific session of the American Heart Association in Washington, D.C., they became front-page news all over America. Dr. Ornish reported that those on the very low-fat, plant-based whole food diet, number one, dropped their cholesterol levels by 24% in the absence of any medication. Number two, their repeat PET scans, these are the special x-rays of the coronary arteries taken at the end of the 1 year study, demonstrated regression of atherosclerotic plaque in 82% of the participants. And number three, the older men with the most advanced disease actually had the best results. Dr. Ornish was able to present scientific evidence that narrowed plaque-filled arteries had actually widened, allowing more blood flow and oxygen to nourish the heart muscle. The atherosclerotic plaques had actually begun to melt down, and the regression process was underway. It was demonstrated that it was progressing even further over the next 5 years. The group on the so-called prudent diet, however, had a mere 5% drop in cholesterol, and 53% of their coronary arteries showed a progression in their plaque buildup. At a press conference, Dr. Ornish concluded, "The moderate diet recommendations of the American Heart Association do not go far enough to effectively influence the progression of coronary heart disease. People with clinically demonstrated disease need to go beyond the present dietary recommendations." And here's a statement to summarize Dr. Ornish's work with heart disease. It says, "Ornish has scientifically proven that people can open their blocked arteries without drugs or surgery. He guides them through a rigorous lifestyle education program, where the key issue is a very simple plant-based diet with a focus on whole, unprocessed foods, foods as grown." And here you see what we do in the CHIP program, the Complete Health Improvement Program, where we lower cholesterol levels that are above 7 millimoles per liter by 20% within 30 days in the absence of any medication. Cholesterol levels come down quite easily and rapidly if you provide the correct diet for these patients. And you may wonder, what is CHIP? CHIP is an intensive 30-hour education program delivered in groups through videos, books, and group discussions. With more than 100,000 graduates, our team has published more than 45 clinical result papers in peer-reviewed medical journals. We can change the atherosclerosis in vessels if we provide the right and correct and intensive education to patients. Let me share something about my friend Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn, a well-known thyroid surgeon at the famous Cleveland Clinic. In the 1980s, however, he began to change his emphasis in his practice and became involved in educating people of how to reverse coronary artery disease. Single-handedly, this physician used a very strict whole food plant-based diet to help serious coronary patients who had been described as the walking dead. Prior to joining his dietary study in 1985, his 18 coronary patients over the previous 8 years had suffered 49 cardiovascular events. These cardiovascular events included angina, myocardial infarction, bypass surgeries, angioplasties, and strokes. During those 8 years, under excellent cardiology care at the Cleveland Clinic, the average cholesterol was 6.0 millimoles per liter. Then they came to Dr. Esselstyn and they said, look, we don't know what to do. We have seen the finest cardiologists, we have had the surgeries, we had all the medications. There's nothing your surgical colleagues can do for us anymore. Can you help us with your dietary program? Subsequently, Dr. Esselstyn enrolled these 18 patients into his arresting and reversing therapy program called the ART, the ART program. Over the next 5 years, the cholesterol levels dropped from 6.0 to 3.5. During that time, being now 5 years older, these patients should have had more heart disease, more clinical events. Instead, they had none of these events. And then another 7 years later, this is now 12 years altogether, the cholesterol level is still averaging 3.6 and still 0 cardiovascular events. Think about that. 8 years under the treatment of some of the best cardiologists with the best medical care, 49 cardiovascular events. But then the people now 12 years older, when they should have had many, many more cardiovascular events, they recorded none of them. 0, 0, 0. Amazing, isn't it? The way you live is the way you die, isn't it? And here are some of the angiographic documentation. Take a look. The one on the left side shows the left arterial descending coronary artery. The circle there shows a severe narrowing of the artery permitting only little blood flow, the obvious cause of angina upon exertion. On the angiogram on the right-hand side, now 2.5 years later, the same artery, the same area x-rayed, and you see a fully functioning coronary artery with restored optimum blood flow and no more angina. The lesson? When angina patients follow a strict program using a very low-fat plant-based diet, angina pain usually diminishes within weeks, in that such a diet decreases blood viscosity, which facilitates greater blood flow and myocardial oxygenation. Actually, Dr. Esselstyn's 20-year follow-up program on his 18 patients has been published in his 2007 book, Prevent and Reverse Heart Disease. Here's Dr. Esselstyn's conclusion. Stents and bypasses have their place in emergency settings. Research, however, shows that the elective application cannot prolong life nor protect from a heart attack. In contrast, plant-based nutrition which treats disease causation, can arrest and reverse cardiovascular illness and stop the epidemic. To summarize, we have known for years that much of today's coronary heart disease can be prevented. But isn't it exciting to realize that under the proper conditions, it is now possible to reverse this disease? Now listen, these revolutionary studies actually now suggest that given the proper diet, we may actually be able to eat ourselves out of heart disease. Are you ready now to take another look at President Clinton after his heart surgeries?
How did you lose so much weight? What kind of diet are you on?
Well, the short answer is I went on essentially a plant-based diet. I live on beans, legumes, vegetables, fruit, no dairy, and it changed my whole metabolism, and I lost 24 pounds, and I got back to basically what I weighed in high school. But I did it for a different reason. I mean, I wanted to lose a little weight, but I didn't dream this would happen. I did it because after I had this stent put in, I realized that even though it happens quite often that after you have bypasses, you lose the veins because they're thinner and weaker than arteries. The truth is that it clogged up, which means that the cholesterol was still causing buildup in my vein that was part of my bypass. And thank God I could take the stents. I don't want it to happen again. So I did all this research, and I saw that 82% of the people since 1986 who have gone on a plant-based, no dairy, no meat of any kind, no chicken, turkey, if you can do it, 82% of the people who've done that have begun to heal themselves. Their arterial blockage cleans up. The calcium deposit around their heart breaks up. This movement has been led by a doctor named Caldwell Esselstyn at the Cleveland Clinic, Dean Ornish, whom you know, out in California, the doctors Campbell, father and son, who wrote the China study, and a handful of others. But we now have 25 years of evidence. And so I thought, well, since I need to lose a little weight for Chelsea's wedding, I'll become part of this experiment. I'll see if I can be one of those that can have a self-clearing mechanism. We'll see.
I hope you're healthy for many years and get to see grandchildren for many years
Me
to
too.
come.
That's really the big deal. You know, Hillary and I, we're happy. We love our son-in-law and we admire him, but we'd like to be around. If there's grandkids, we want to be there to do our part.
Mr. President, good luck.
Thank you.
Thanks for what you're doing.
Thanks.
And look what happened. The former president with a new lifestyle where food becomes the new medicine. Nobody expected that from the president, but he did. This is the new entertainment style of Bill Clinton since he saw the film Forks Over Knives, which actually means that when it comes to heart disease, the dietary fork may be more important than the surgeon's knife. Well, we can also talk about the common form of diabetes. Diabetes can be disarmed and diabetes can be reversed. You know, once we make the right lifestyle changes, it's not that difficult to do. Let me give you some examples. Here's 1995, Dr. Inder Singh published in the Lancet Journal a study which he conducted with 80 diabetic patients on insulin. Dr. Singh gave these patients a very low-fat diet of natural whole foods, and within days, the blood sugar levels began to drop. And within 6 weeks, 50 of his 80 diabetics on insulin were free of any insulin and their blood sugars were normal. They were no longer diabetics as long as they followed the program. We found similar blood sugar reductions in our CHIP program. Here, as you can see, within 30 days, 40% of the diabetics in our program were no longer diabetics in that their blood sugar levels became settled down to normal. And Professor James Anderson, a revered endocrinologist, author of over 500 books, medical articles, and chapters in books, stated with confidence that some 50 to 75% of type 2 diabetics on insulin and 80 to 90% of those on pills could normalize their blood sugars and be off medication within weeks if they changed their diet. And what would their diet be? Plant-based whole foods, high in fiber. And the same is true for high blood pressure. After attending a 30-day residential program where people followed a very simple dietary program, 55% of those high blood pressure patients on medications for at least 2 years were no longer on medication within 30 days. Their blood pressures had come down, their levels had normalized, they were no longer hypertensive. Similarly, of those attending our CHIP program, 67% of these patients entering the lifestyle program in the very high diastolic blood pressure range were no longer in that range within 30 days. Their blood pressures had normalized and they had to be taken off their medications.
My name's Joe Monaco, and prior to the CHIP program, my life was basically starting to spiral down with one kidney. Lost my kidney 20 years ago. I've had diabetes for over 10 years. I really owe this CHIP program for turning my life around.
Around the world, there is a pandemic issue. Lifestyle diseases are taking over.
When we look at the disease burden in the United States and more around the world, what we see is that it's chronic disease. It's these non-communicable diseases that stay with people for weeks, months, years, even decades.
Being a medical doctor, knowing a lot about medication and drugs, I'm not against conventional medicine. I really feel it has its role, but we know that when it comes to lifestyle, conventional medicine doesn't do very well because we treat the results, we're not actually managing the cause. And this is where CHIP is so incredibly powerful.
My husband joined the group, which surprised me because he's been a butcher all his life. He actually lost 10 kilos in the first 4 weeks.
What a joy to see someone respond in a way that our medication can't fix.
CHIP can be the connection for people that don't believe that they can do better to become whole person health warriors. And I think that's what CHIP is all about.
These are things that I want for my patients, and to be able to do that with this natural, holistic approach rather than prescribing a pill, to me, it's the best thing in the world.
The transformation of lives that I witness, this is priceless. There's nothing that could buy that.
I think we've realized when we look at health and wellness that there's the mental aspect and the spiritual aspect. And if you don't address those issues, often people don't really get as well or improve as much as they should. And that's been the joy of running a CHIP program that is so balanced the way CHIP is presented.
My world is better.
What a joy for me to see lives turning around from disease to health, from worries to confidence. Here are then some dietary recommendations for your consideration. I think it's obvious. We need a new cow. A cow that's low in calories, no cholesterol, no saturated fat, and high in nutrients and high in fiber. Well, look at the Harvard recommended eating plate. On the first half of the plate, lots of vegetables, especially green vegetables, and fresh fruits. And on the other half of the plate, there should be lots of whole grains and plenty of healthy proteins. Those protein foods could include some animal products, but the protein-rich beans and lentils should not be overlooked. What about dairy products? The recommended Harvard eating plate left them totally out. It replaced milk as a side dish with water. And here you have the dietary recommendations by the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, headed by Dr. Neal Barnard. What are they recommending? A plant-based diet with lots of whole foods coming from fruits, vegetables, legumes, and whole grains. In actual numbers then, the contrast between the standard American diet and a more optimal diet is obvious. You want to decisively reduce your fats and oils from about 100 grams on the average to about 40 grams, and your cholesterol from 400 milligrams to less than 50 milligrams. Of course, if you are choosing to be a total vegetarian, then your cholesterol intake would automatically be zero, right? Now, when it comes to the consumption of added sugars, we recommend cut back from the average standard of 35 teaspoons a day to less than 10 teaspoons a day. And cut your daily salt intake of 10 grams at least in half. But actually, the body requires only about 1 gram of salt a day, while we are taking in America 10 times that amount. And what about fiber? Most Americans, with all those refined and engineered foods, may only be getting a measly 10 grams of fiber a day. We probably should have more than 35 to 60 grams of fiber. And with that, we would not only alleviate a lot of problems of the intestinal system, but we would also substantially strengthen our immune system. Now, when it comes to water, well, most of us don't drink enough of this no-calorie drink. We should really push the daily water consumption. The more, the better. And this means then that a more optimal diet would focus on a wide variety of plant-based whole foods, foods that are largely low in calories and that we can eat freely without all the added refined fats and oils, sugars and salt. It's a diet that is respectful of traditional foods, that keeps refined, processed and engineered foods at a minimum. And if you insist on eating animal products, then maybe recommend that you use them only as a seasoning or as a condiment rather than as a main part of the dish. For good health and for a long life, may we recommend fresh fruits and vegetables, whole grains, and plenty of legumes like beans, peas, and lentils, and enough water to float a battleship. And couple this with daily exercise, stress management, and obviously no tobacco, and you have a prescription for a healthier, a happier, and a longer life. Now, in case you think that it would be too hard to make that big jump all at once towards a diet that is largely centered on plant foods and whole foods, then let me show you the next graph. On this red and green graph, you have on your left side the typical American diet: meat, dairy, eggs, processed foods, alcohol, and lots of caffeine. At the same time, you also have listed at the top the worst health outcomes and the shortest health span and the shortest lifespan. These are obviously the American or Western diseases, the chronic diseases. But then, as you move towards the right-hand side of the graph, towards the full green triangle, you begin to eat less and less of the foods in the red triangle, and you begin to eat more and more foods in the green triangle, where the emphasis is on fruits and vegetables, on whole grains, and lots of beans and legumes, and some nuts and seeds, and plenty of water. And that's where you will also have the best health outcome, and the longest health span, and the longest lifespan. Eating plant-based, then, is about widening our circle of compassion and avoiding unnecessary pain, suffering, and death. Think of our animals as friends. And then give some thought to a well-intended suggestion from one of our fine-feathered friends. Eat more kale. And then to finish it up, here's my friend Dr. Dean Ornish. He said, what's good for you and your health is also good for our planet. And it's good for the animals. They will thank you for it. Although heart disease and diabetes will kill more people each year worldwide than all other diseases combined, these diseases are completely preventable and even reversible for at least 90% of the people today if they change their diet and lifestyle. So, in summarizing, we have a choice. Moving towards a plant-based, whole food diet seems to me to be the very responsible and enlightened choice on a planet that is fighting for its survival. Fork and knife. They're either weapons of mass destruction or they can be instruments of healthier, happier, and longer life. What are you putting at the end of your fork?
What will your last 10 years look like? Will you be quick enough for a game of tag with your grandchild? Strong enough to embrace every moment? Will you grow old with vitality? Or get old with disease? It's time to decide. The average Canadian will spend their last 10 years in sickness.
Blessings on you, good health, and a long life.